Okay, so welcome to the deep dive. As always, we have a really interesting topic for
Yeah.
our deep dive today.
Yeah.
You sent over the Incredible India podcast,
Yes.
a journey through time and culture, and wow.
It's an amazing resource.
It is. There's so much there. I mean, just listening to it, it's clear that we could probably do like
Oh, easily.
10 deep dives
Absolutely.
and just barely scratch the surface.
Yeah.
But we're going to do our best to pull out some of the most
Yeah.
interesting threads and give a good overview of India. So,
Well, and I think one thing that's interesting is that it goes all the way from,
right.
ancient India
So it's
to modern
India.
technology,
Cuisine,
culture.
everything.
And that's one of the things that makes it so fascinating is that it really is a journey through time.
It is.
And as they say, incredible India, right?
Absolutely.
So let's start at the beginning.
Okay.
The podcast takes us way back
Yeah,
to the Indus Valley Civilization.
Yeah, over 5,000 years. 5,000 years.
So this was,
Hard to even fathom.
I know, one of the world's oldest civilizations. I mean, think about that for a second. And
Right.
it's considered one of the cradles of civilization.
Yeah, and what stood out to me in that section was when they talked about the level of urban planning
Oh, yeah.
in the cities.
Yeah.
Like they had sophisticated drainage systems,
Right.
grid layout.
It's very advanced for their time.
Right, and it just makes you think like, wow, they were thinking about
Public health.
public health.
Urban living.
And urban living in a really organized way.
Organized way, yeah.
Thousands of years ago.
Mm.
Like, that's
Pretty remarkable.
really incredible.
Yeah.
And of course, speaking of incredible, the podcast highlights
Okay.
how many things we use or think about today
Mhm.
originated
Yeah.
in ancient India. I mean, yoga,
Yoga, Ayurveda.
Ayurveda, even the concept of zero.
Yeah.
Like, that is mind-blowing.
The concept of nothing.
It's huge.
Right. Which is fundamental to
Fundamental to mathematics.
mathematics.
I mean,
Wow.
and still practiced today.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Still with us today.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we move on from the Indus Valley Civilization into the Vedic period.
Okay.
Now, this is where we start to see the foundations of Hinduism.
Exactly. Through the sacred texts.
Right through those sacred texts like the Vedas.
The Vedas.
Which are still so important to millions of people.
Absolutely.
And this is a good time to point out that, I mean, throughout our deep dive today,
All right.
we are really only
Scratching the surface.
scratching the surface of
Right.
this incredibly vast and complex topic.
Yes.
But we're doing our best. Okay, so then we get to these
Right.
big empires,
Yeah.
the Mauryan and Gupta empires.
Yeah.
Now, the podcast does a great job of explaining how they built upon the knowledge of previous civilizations.
Absolutely. They didn't just start from scratch. They built upon what had already been done.
Right. They made significant strides.
In science and math.
Governance.
And really expanded their influence.
They did, yeah.
I mean, one of the figures that really stuck with me from this era is Ashoka.
Yes.
And, the podcast really highlights,
He's a fascinating character.
it's a fascinating character
Mm-hmm.
because he's this powerful emperor who ultimately promotes peace and spreads Buddhism
Right.
across Asia.
Mhm.
It's a really incredible story of transformation and the impact one person can have.
Absolutely. And you think about, the spread of Buddhism from India to
To all over Asia.
all over Asia. It's quite remarkable.
It is. And then we get to what's often referred to as India's golden age,
Yeah.
the Gupta period.
Yes.
And it's called that for good reason. I mean, the podcast talks about how advancements were happening across all these different fields.
Oh, yeah. Astronomy, medicine, literature.
They made these incredibly accurate calculations about planetary movements.
Planetary movements. They had sophisticated surgical techniques at the time.
It's really remarkable what they achieved.
It is.
Okay, so we've got this incredibly long and rich history.
They're very rich.
But India has also been this crossroads of
cultures.
cultures and empires.
Great.
So the podcast talks about Alexander the Great coming through, but his influence was relatively brief.
Okay.
But then we get to the Delhi Sultanate,
Yeah.
which had a much more lasting impact.
Yeah, and that kind of sets the stage
Yes.
for the Mughal Empire.
Right, and the Mughal Empire is really where the podcast
It's a huge part of the story.
spends a lot of time.
Yes.
And for good reason.
Yes.
Because this is a period that really shapes India's architecture.
Yes. Art, culture.
Art, culture, language, I
Absolutely.
mean, their influence is still felt today. And I think the most obvious example of that is
The Taj Mahal.
the Taj Mahal.
Yes.
I mean, that is such a globally recognized symbol of India.
The breathtaking monument.
Right. And it's not just a monument to love, but
It's
also
art.
to the artistic and engineering
Absolute.
prowess of the Mughals.
Amazing what they were able to accomplish.
I mean, that inlay work, the symmetry, the scale of it, it's just breathtaking.
Yeah. And think about, too, it was a fusion of different architectural styles.
Right.
They came together.
Right. Yeah.
In the Taj Mahal.
Really an incredible achievement.
Right.
But as the podcast reminds us, all empires rise and fall.
They do.
And the Mughal Empire was no different.
Right.
And it's their decline that actually opens the door for European traders.
Yes.
And ultimately leads to British colonization.
Yeah. And that's a whole other chapter.
Other chapter in Indian history.
Absolutely.
And of course, that brings us to the independence movement.
Right.
Nearly 200 years of British rule. That's a substantial amount of time.
It is. Yeah.
And the podcast highlights that the desire for self-rule was always there.
Always simmering under the surface.
Right. It never went away. And this is where we see these iconic figures emerge.
Yes. Mahatma Gandhi.
Mahatma Gandhi.
Jawaharlal Nehru. Subhash Chandra Bose.
Yeah. And each one of these leaders took a slightly different approach.
Yeah, they had different ideas about how to
the struggle.
Yeah.
I mean, Gandhi with his nonviolent civil disobedience,
Right.
which, as we know, had a ripple effect around the world.
Absolutely. I mean, inspired so many other...
And then others advocated for different forms of resistance.
Right.
But it really shows the depth of the movement.
It does, yeah. It
Yeah.
shows how many people were
involved.
dedicated to this idea of freedom.
And they eventually achieve independence on August 15th, 1947.
Which is a remarkable feat.
Huge day.
Absolutely.
So India becomes the world's largest democracy.
Largest democracy.
Which is pretty amazing considering all the complexity.
Considering the diversity of the country.
Right. Okay, so from this incredibly complex and rich history,
Yeah.
we move to something that's just as complex and arguably even more fascinating,
Okay.
which is India's cultural diversity.
I mean, where do we even begin?
Where do you even begin? 28 states.
28 states, 8 union territories.
And each one with its own
Languages.
customs, traditions.
Foods, festivals.
It's just incredible. It really is a mosaic.
It is, yeah. And sometimes...
On a massive scale.
Yeah, and, a festival in one part of the country can look completely different from a festival in another part of the country.
Absolutely. And then you have the religious landscape.
Right.
I mean, you've got...
It's really remarkable
It's
how Hinduism, Islam, Christianity, Sikhism, Buddhism, Jainism.
All coexisting.
All coexisting, yeah. And not just coexisting, but in many cases...
Influencing each other.
Yeah.
And I thought it was really interesting in the podcast when they talked about how festivals often transcend religious boundaries.
Yes. They become cultural events.
Yeah, we've got Diwali, Eid, Christmas, Holy, people of all faiths come together and celebrate. It's a really beautiful thing. And of course, we can't talk about Indian culture without talking about Bollywood.
Oh, Bollywood. It's a massive film industry. And it has global reach.
Global reach. I mean, it's influencing fashion and music all over the world. And speaking of things that influence the world,
yes,
let's talk about food.
Okay. Yeah, because Indian cuisine, that's a whole...
Indian cuisine is a
whole deep dive right there.
Right. But even just thinking about it.
Right. But even just the little bit that the podcast touched on...
It makes your mouth water.
It does. Just thinking about the regional specialties.
Yeah.
You've got in the north...
Yeah.
Butter chicken, biryani.
Biryani, those
richer flavors, right?
Right.
And then in the south, you've got dosa, idli. And it's so fascinating.
And it's all influenced by...
how different the flavors are.
Geography and climate.
And the ingredients that are available in different regions.
And then there's the street food.
Oh, the street food.
I mean, I'm just thinking about
Pani puri
and samosas and chat.
So good. It's like an explosion of flavors and textures.
It's like an incredible sensory experience.
And it's a really important part of the culture, too.
Right.
It's not just something you eat. It's a social experience.
And we can't forget about the masala chai.
Oh, masala chai. I mean, that's like...
It's not just a drink. It's a ritual.
It's everywhere.
It's part of everyday life.
You can't walk down the street without seeing someone drinking masala chai.
Okay, so we go on this journey from ancient civilizations.
Yes.
Through this rich history and culture. And the podcast brings us
to modern India.
Yeah.
And it's really exciting to see what's happening there.
It's an exciting time for India. I mean, you're becoming this major player on the world stage.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, they're a technological powerhouse.
Yeah. I mean, they're leaders in IT.
Pharmaceuticals.
And there's a space program.
Space exploration. I mean, ISRO.
That's incredible. I mean, ISRO's missions to Mars and the moon.
Right.
Those are huge achievements.
Remarkable. And what I think is really interesting is the startup ecosystem.
Yeah.
That's thriving.
Especially in places like
Bengaluru.
Yeah.
Bengaluru.
There's so much innovation and entrepreneurial spirit there.
It's really remarkable. And of course, the digital revolution is transforming India.
Absolutely. It's connecting people in ways that were never possible before and creating opportunities.
And of course, the podcast does acknowledge that there are still challenges.
There are. Poverty, pollution. These are serious issues.
But it really feels like India is moving forward with this energy and resilience.
Yeah.
And towards the end of the podcast, they highlight some really interesting facts.
Yes, about India.
Yeah, I love these little nuggets.
That I think kind of helps paint this picture of this amazing country. So, for example, India has the world's largest postal network.
Which is crazy when you think about how big the country is.
I mean, it includes a floating post office on Dal Lake.
On Dal Lake, yeah. How cool is that?
That's so cool.
Yeah.
And then there's the Kumbh Mela Festival, which is the largest gathering of human beings on the planet. I mean,
it's so big you can see it from space.
So big.
It's mind-boggling.
And you can see it from space.
Yeah. It really gives you a sense of the...
And then they highlight some of the things that originated in India that have had a global impact. I mean...
Like chess, yoga, and the decimal system.
Like, these are fundamental concepts that we...
Yeah, and we use them every day. Without even thinking about it.
And then this one really blew my mind. Yep. India is the second largest English-speaking country.
After the USA.
Yeah. I mean, that's incredible.
Yeah, it just shows you how India is this blend of the ancient and the modern.
It's really remarkable. So
as we wrap up here, what are your...
as we come to the end of our deep dive...
takeaways.
What are my key takeaways? I mean, I think...
What are you walking away with?
It's the sheer depth and continuity of India's story. I mean, from these ancient civilizations that laid these intellectual foundations to a modern nation that's at the forefront of technology.
Yes.
And the cultural richness.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, the way that all these different traditions and beliefs coexist, it's really inspiring.
It is. And I think, we have to remember that even though we spent, almost an hour talking about this, we've only just scratched the surface.
Barely scratched the surface.
India is a vast and complex country, and there's so much more to explore.
Absolutely. So for you, the listener, I want to leave you with this thought. How does this interplay between these ancient traditions that are so deeply rooted, and these rapid advancements,
the modern advancements
that India is making today,
how
does that position India in shaping
in the future
of our world?
Yeah,
it's a fascinating question.
It is, and it's one that I think we'll all be grappling with.
I think so too.
For years to come.
Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.